Three, two, one. Folks, I'm Doug Page, and today I'm joined by retired U.S. Navy Captain James Fanell and his co-author, Dr. Bradley Thayer. They've written a book entitled Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure. Captain Fanell spent 29 years in the United States Navy and was the intelligence director of the United States Pacific Fleet, which took him across Asia and probably many other locations too as well. Dr. Thayer holds a Ph.D. and is a founding member of the Committee on Present Danger in Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, thank you for being here today.
Thank you. It's our pleasure.
Super. Well, so I'm sure this analogy has been used before, but I'll go ahead and give it a go anyway. It looks like it's 1941 all over again. China is the new Japan and arming up. And like last time, just before that fateful day back in December 1941, the United States is asleep. Does this analogy ring true, or is it altogether false? Jim?
Well, from my perspective, yeah, I'll start off. When I was before I was at the Pacific Fleet, I was out on the USS Kitty Hawk 4 deployed in Japan as a director of intelligence for that strike group in 2003 to 2005. And I used to tell my admiral in the morning briefings that it sure felt like we were in 1936. Now, that's about 20 years ago, so maybe the time line is stretched a bit. But this threat trajectory by the PRC has been growing for quite some time. And I think that's really the thesis of our book, which is it's been available, the evidence has been there, but for some reasons that we'll talk about that occupy our book, the United States government didn't recognize it and didn't deal with it.
Brad, do you have any thoughts about that?
I do, Doug, and thanks for having us on. It's a great pleasure to join you today. I do. It's much worse than 1941. It's much worse because of the engagement school, the fact that our elites are cooperating with our enemy, which was certainly not the case in 1941, where there was great cognizance of the threats that the United States faced. Here, we have an elite which have profited from communist China and continue to profit from communist China. So the closest historical comparison in American history, you have to go back to the War of 1812, where the New England Federalists were cooperating with the British and selling them goods and as they conducted their invasion of the United States. It's a very dire situation, and it really illuminates the uniqueness of the situation that we're in now, where our elites, the Biden administration, and so many others cannot even say that the PRC is an enemy. And if you can't say that you have an enemy, then you're certainly in dire straits.
So a couple of follow-up questions to that, Brad. When you say that sort of thing, I mean, when you talk about elites, who are you pointing the finger to exactly in the United States?
Well, Doug, I'm sorry to say that it's the totality, almost the totality of our elites going to Wall Street, the Chamber of Commerce, the investment, the trade with the People's Republic of China, our media, by and large, our universities, our think tanks have heavy influence by the People's Republic of China, which, as we illuminate in the book, was Deng Xiaoping's strategy. Right, his strategy to save communism in China in 1989 and the immediate aftermath was to make the American elites his partner, allow them to profit from manufacturing and economic growth in the People's Republic of China. And he succeeded beyond his wildest ambition in doing so. And so we've had, really since the Clinton administration, a bipartisan problem where both Republicans and Democrats have profited from their relationship with the People's Republic of China. Media have, of course, our universities, et cetera. The national security community, even the think tanks that are tasked with guarding American national security are not immune from this pernicious influence.
Gotcha. You know, when you talk about, engaging China economically, but this issue is really important to where we are today, and sort of given that the United States has this history of engagement, with all sorts of countries, with all sorts of government and political systems, it seems almost contrary not to engage with them But one of the themes that I always heard about, and correct me if I'm wrong, was that if we engaged with China economically, that somehow this would turn the country into a democracy. Um, but when it comes to China and the Chinese Communist Party, this seems different. What's different here?
Well, there's much which is different, and that's the key issue, Doug. That there was, as we document in the book, the end of history moment. You may recall those heady days where Francis Fukuyama wrote an essay and then a book, which was widely popular, widely believed by American elites, that we had reached the triumph of capitalism and liberal democracy, and that was the wave of the future in a Hegelian sense. Of course, Deng Xiaoping did not share that, and the Communist Party of China did not share that, and worked assiduously to ensure that did not happen. So that widespread belief blinded us to some degree, at least, in terms of being able to identify the threat as it continued to grow year after year. What we call in the book threat deflation. The American elites were heavily affected by consistently deflating the threat from communist China. We're blind to it year after year as the threat grew, again, year after year, as their military capabilities grew year after year. And yet we did nothing about it until the Trump administration. So we got ourselves into this fix. It was basically the American elite having been made a partner of the Communist Party of China, who delivered us to this situation. And of course, in the book, we illuminate measures that we can take to address it.
Sure. You know, if you're going to look at the beginning of the relationship between the United States and China and the Chinese Communist Party and the Beijing government, you know, you have to look at President Nixon. Was he wrong to initiate diplomatic ties with Beijing way back in 1972?
He didn't cut ties with Taiwan. I mean, he started opening the door by sending Kissinger on that covert mission in '71, and he did it because of the threat from the Soviet Union. And so, in some sense, you could say because of the threat of the Soviet Union was clearly much, much greater than anything that the PRC could throw at us economically, militarily, of any way, shape, or form. They were devastated from the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward before that. So the threat really to the United States existentially at that moment in time was the Soviet Union. And so there was a concern that was the number one concern, and using China as an offset to be able to get in and be able to pressurize the Soviets from their soft underbelly, if you will, and to allow us to even have in the book we talk about this intelligence operations that we had in China that were there to monitor Soviet ballistic missile launches and provide us that data. So in the beginning, it makes sense. It's not a strategic failure in that sense. And they weren't really necessarily embracing, they were opening a door. And so really, it's the transition from opening a door through Tiananmen where at that point, we should have said to ourselves, hold on a minute, these guys are hardcore communists, they'll kill their own people. And that's when things should have started to change for us. Maybe before that, but certainly by 1989, 91.
So when you refer to Tiananmen, you're talking about the Tiananmen Square massacre, which happened there, and George H.W. Bush is the president at that point of the United States. And what did the United States want to see after the result of the Tiananmen Square, and what should it have seen?
Well, what it wanted to see was sadly, the Bush administration worked cooperatively with Deng's government, fearing instability in China. And there was also a concern that maybe the Soviet Union was not dead yet. The stake hadn't been driven through its heart. We didn't know what was happening until obviously the August coup of 1991, the failed coup attempt in August of 1991 really shows the true state to everyone, the true state of the Soviet Union. So the Bush administration had a strategic misstep there where when it had the opportunity to put great pressure on the Communist China, the Chinese Communist Party to reform, to democratize, where it was a period of the CCP was at a period of great vulnerability, The Bush administration did not. And then he was widely criticized. Doug, you may remember this from the 1992 campaign, where the Clinton-Gore campaign criticized President Bush for coddling dictators from Baghdad to Beijing. That was really their policy for about 1.5 years into the Clinton administration, where they reversed themselves and did their utmost to ensure that trade investment flowed into the PRC. So Bush had an opportunity to squeeze them. Clinton did as well, had an opportunity. But by the time that you have had in mid-Clinton, by the time you have had strong business ties, interests, and Deng's strategy realized, where Wall Street investors and Democrats are all cooperating to ensure that relationship continues to flower. 9/11 happens, of course, and the Bush administration, second Bush, obviously, administration, George W. Bush administration, takes us in a different direction, going into Southwest Asia, Afghanistan, of course, and then the Iraq War, which consumes all of the oxygen in the room, of course, for a decade. Obama had rhetorically a pivot to Asia, but in practice, that was nothing of the kind. And it only comes to the Trump administration where real actions are taken, sadly, largely reversed by the Biden administration.
Sure. When you just think about going back to the Nixon administration, which presidential administration do you see as the most culpable for making China what it is today? Is there one? Is there two? And interestingly enough, as you point out in your book, it's very much a bipartisan effort too as well. But is there one administration which is perhaps a bit more responsible than others?
Well, I would say if certainly the Truman administration really is, if we want to go back and really look at the totality of this, it was really with Truman, Marshall Mission, which was an embarrassment, and then the Wiedemeyer Mission on the heels. It was the Truman administration's, if you will, fetters placed on Chiang Kai-shek in 1945 and 1946 in particular, where Chiang wanted to move aggressively against the communists in Manchuria at that time. So if we're looking, I think, in the scope of Sino-American relationship, we can see that the Clinton administration certainly made a profound mistake in not recognizing the nature of Chinese communism. So that's where I would identify it. As Jim identified, Nixon recognized for good power politics reasons, right? You want to give the Soviet Union another front.
I would, if you'd asked me, I would have said the Obama administration is the current version of the worst, in my opinion, and that's largely from my time at sea and watching the impacts of the decisions of speaking about pivoting to the Pacific, but doing nothing about it, and then actually sitting by and watching China seize Scarborough Shoal, build 7 artificial islands in the Spratlys, and then promise not to militarize them, and did all that under the Obama administration, which in a way really put the green light to the Chinese Communist Party to allow somebody like Xi Jinping to come in and completely overturn Deng's hide and bide strategy, which served them so well for the previous 35 or so years. What Obama did essentially opened up a Pandora's box for the Chinese Communist Party to really aggressively move forward in their great rejuvenation scheme and China Dream.
So going on that idea here, Jim, with President Obama and his administration, and it's talk about trying to curtail China's ambitions in the South China Sea and the Spratly Islands, which it didn't do. Why doesn't the administration act? Do we have any clear ideas about why the administration didn't take any action against China in the South China Sea? And then how did U.S. allies in Australia, the Philippines, Japan, South Korea, and certainly Taiwan, how do they view President Obama's actions?
Well, on the first question, it's clear that the administration was fully immersed in the engagement school. And so they were true believers in engagement. And that, as Brad mentions, and in our book we explore in detail, the engagement school gives rise to all sorts of things like the threat deflation that we get from the DoD and the intelligence community over the years to downplay the threat. So you're getting people whispering and saying, oh, it's not really that important, it's just a bunch of rocks. So that's one aspect of it. Then there's the other side of the engagement school, which is more of what you see in the last couple of years from Graham Allison's book, The Thucydides Trap. There's this idea that if we confront the PRC on anything, it's going to go from, status quo to thermonuclear war. There's no in between. And, in the Cold War with the Soviets, we had varying gradations of threat escalation, hundreds of steps in between status quo, peacetime to thermonuclear war. But somehow with the People's Republic of China, it's either we do what they say or it's thermonuclear war, and there's no intermediary steps. And so you get a lot of that. You had a lot of people inside the Obama administration that were constantly backing off China. If we were sending envoys to China, it used to be if you sent the president, the vice president, or secretary of state, or SecDef, that we would back off our sensitive reconnaissance operations during the period of their visit. Well, under Obama, that went all the way down to, 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 tiers, deputy undersecretaries and things of that nature. And so we were approaching this thing of and I heard the phrase when I was on active duty: do not provoke. We must not provoke. We cannot provoke Beijing. We must not provoke China. And that was all driven by a fear of some kind of irrational belief that there would be thermonuclear war. So I think it was a combination of true belief in the engagement school and there's many reasons why people are engagers. There's a profitability piece of it. There's a ideological belief that some have. And then there's this idea of, people are afraid. And I think we're now at this point, several years later, we're a decade on from the Scarborough Shoal and the Spratly Island build. And we have people that are now, they were deniers of the threat. And now they've flipped in a way and they've become defeatists. And they've said, the threat's too dire. It's too strong. They've got the biggest Navy, the biggest rocket force. We can't get involved because they'll destroy us. So I think we've handcuffed ourselves and we've lost, as Brad really writes a lot eloquently in the book about this power politics and real politic of how we should deal with the PRC.
Gotcha. Then you still have this idea of, U.S. allies, countries around the globe are certainly looking at United States actions or lack of actions. I mean, when we do nothing to counter China in the South China Sea, and we've had maybe a tepid response, some might say, to its patrols around Taiwan. I mean, how are U.S. allies seeing the United States? The country has long been the great defender of democracy, the great defender of human rights, the great defender of economic rights around the globe. It's gotten itself in a few jams as a result of that too as well. But that's really how the country has been perceived, and that's sort of the message of the United States. When we take a lack of actions, how are other countries seeing us?
They see weakness. They see weakness, and we hear from it from our allies. When we don't take the measures that we say that we're going to do with our treaty allies, they know this. Now, what you won't hear in the public domain so much is they don't talk about it. They won't talk about, you'll hear a lot of talk from the ASEAN nations about they don't want to be held to a choice. They don't want to have to choose between the United States or China. But inside, when you talk to them privately, they're very concerned about the United States not living up to its commitments. And I think that's something that people don't really appreciate. I think in the back home in the United States is that the allies are critical, as you mentioned, and they have worries. They have worries about whether or not we're going to be following through with our commitments to defend them. We have 5 allies in the Pacific. We have Japan, treaty allies, Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Thailand, and Australia. And, they all wonder now, after what they've seen, especially in this last 3 years, whether or not we will live up to them. And as is going on right as we're speaking, or it's probably finished tonight, this big exercise, Joint Sword 2024 Alpha, people are wondering, what is the United States going to do when it comes to defending America's interests in Asia? And we have people that are in harm's way if China were to invade Taiwan. And we have American forces stationed throughout the region. What will happen to them? And these questions are asked by our allies in private, and they hedge their bet. They don't want to talk out loud too much, because what happens if they're right or the answers are not what they like, and they have to go now snuggle up to Beijing. And so this is really something that's serious, because our force structure, our military power is much smaller And we talk a lot about the power of our alliance structure being not just an economic power, but it's also part of our military strategy. And so if we can't really rely on our military alliance, that puts everything at great risk.
And being an American overseas and being an American in the United States is a very, very different experience, Jim, as you know all too well from your time on active duty and certainly currently where you're living too as well. Are you hearing a lot of talk from people where you are currently now in Switzerland about this issue, where people are saying to you, gee, what is the United States up to?
I think I do hear that. I hear people are concerned, but there's always a bit of a lag. And so I think, and Europe, being here in Europe, Europe's naturally much more leaning towards the left, if you will. And so there has been a natural, support for the Obama administration, a natural support for the Biden administration. 3 years ago, you couldn't get anybody to say anything, or 3 to 7 years ago, you couldn't get anybody to say anything positive about Trump in any way, shape, or form. And now people whisper and talk. They don't write about it too much, but they whisper to you and they tell you in dinners, hey, yeah, this is what's going on. What are you guys doing? And when they see some of the things that are not even just military related, like I just got sent the video, it shows sailors on board a warship, a Navy carrier, walking around with lipstick, a man putting lipstick on, and this kind of forced wokeism into our military. People are starting to question. They know that our numbers are down in terms of naval ships and submarines and our shipyards and all of this, that's coming out. But now when they start wondering about, and recruiting numbers are down, and then the people we are recruiting are, going on TikTok and all these other things and displaying a kind of a martial spirit that we never had in the history, it makes people wonder.
Sure. You talked about at one point, Jim, the changes you had seen in the Chinese Navy 1 year to a number of years later. Can you discuss that here for us, please?
Well, sure. If you go back to, say, 1999, 2000, the Chinese military, the Navy specifically, what we'd call a brown water Navy. They didn't really venture much far from coast. They had small numbers, very small numbers, less than 100 combatants. They were old combatants, some even dating back to World War II, Mao's Navy certainly in the 50s. And they didn't really venture far from sea, and they didn't operate with other services. And now here we are in 2024, and we're watching, I think there was 16 naval combatants surrounding Taiwan in the last 24 hours, coordinated operations with the PLA Air Force, the PLA Strategic Rocket Force, land-based Army assets that are involved. So it's a much more, and the numbers are much greater across the board. I think we all know that 2 years ago, the Department of Defense officially announced that the PLA Navy was the largest Navy in the world. A couple of months ago, Admiral Aquilino, before he left Indo-PACOM, stated that he believes that the PLA Air Force may be the largest Air Force in the world now, or at least certainly in Asia. And the Strategic Rocket Force is the largest strategic rocket force in the world. I think I can say that. Some people say that maybe Russia is, but I think the Chinese are much bigger now and much more advanced in terms of the array of weapon systems. So we're watching in just a quarter of a century somebody that went from not having any capability to now openly challenging, or we're debating whether or not we should even keep aircraft carriers in the U.S. because of the threats that they pose to us. And as Brad mentions before, and we talk about in the book, we funded it. We paid for it. Americans, not just the politicians you asked who should we blame? Well, we can blame everybody that Brad noted, but we can also look in the mirror and blame ourselves. How many times do we go to Walmart or wherever it is and we buy something that says made in China? All that money went to them, and they used part of it to fund and build their Navy.
Sure. You say the United States should roll back China's gains in the South China Sea, perhaps even take a much more aggressive approach. Can you lay this out in terms of what you mean? I mean, should we take military action against China? I mean, what do we need to do to counter this threat as it stands today?
You want to answer that, Brad, or I can?
Oh, go ahead, Jim. I mean,
we talk about the military aspects of it, but before we get into the military aspects, I mean, there's clearly, diplomatic information economic pressures that we can bring to bear on China and what they do in the region. So, for instance, in the Spratlys right now, we have, at the Second Thomas Shoal, the Chinese have been threatening for a decade, but it's ramped up here in the last year, the Filipinos' ability to resupply their grounded amphibious warship from World War II called the Sierra Madre. It's sitting on a shoal. There's 10 sailors on board. They've been there for literally 25 years, rotating every 3 or 4 months, 10 sailors. And they just sit there just to make sure that they have a physical claim over something that's well within the Republic of the Philippines exclusive economic zone. It's only like 70 miles from their coast of the Palawan Island. So it's clearly in their sphere of influence, and yet China continually thrashes and harasses their ships so that now the Philippine Navy can't even resupply these sailors. So they have to use Coast Guard or private fishing boats, banca boats, and the Chinese continue to harass and shoot water cannons here in the last few months, damaging vessels, threatening to ram, taking increased actions. Well, what are we doing about that? Couldn't we help the Filipinos resupply those sailors? Couldn't we actually help them build out that grounded LST and make a platform there and pour some concrete? I mean, China poured literally thousands and thousands of hectares or acres of land in the 7 islands that they made. They destroyed the ecosystem. And I'm not saying we should destroy the ecosystem, but I mean, they did profound damage to the ecosystem of the South China Sea, as documented by the 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling. But we can't help the Philippines that maybe build something that's more permanent so that they can keep their legitimate claim going. Doesn't mean that we have to go to war with China, but those are the kind of measures that we could start taking. And then up to the higher end, there's other ways that we could deal with that. I don't think that's the first step. There's many ways to get with them and to deal with them. And there's embargoes, there's things that we could do to the Chinese economy. We could make it difficult for other nations in ASEAN to deal and trade with China. We could appeal to them to trade with other nations, things of that nature. So there's a lot more that we could do, but it all rests upon, and I don't know if we'll get into it, but the recommendations we make in the book. And the first one is we have to start treating China for the threat that it really is.
Sure. So
I would just, Doug, if I could just add one point on what Jim said. What the South China Sea demonstrates, this is empirical evidence of their aggression. So this expansion, seizing a sea, which is what they're doing, and they're doing the same in the East China Sea, is territorial expansion. They think of, in their military doctrine, as their admirals and others have defined, they think of the sea as territory. It is land to be taken, to be seized from others. And so an indication of their aggressiveness is evinced right on a daily basis in the South China Sea. Their aggression against the Filipinos, the Vietnamese, obviously Taiwan, the Japanese, and the East China Sea. And this needs to be seen by Americans, right? This is happening now, and it's equivalent to a Sudetenland Czech crisis in 1938, a type of historical comparison.
Sure. So what you're suggesting, Jim, just to back up here for a second, is you're saying that, show the American flag. I mean, even if you just sent a destroyer over to this disputed island with the Philippines, in the South China Sea, and then you said you sent a construction team. I mean, that alone, it sounds like, based on what you're saying, could make Beijing perhaps reconsider what it's up to. Am I correct about that?
I think that's part of the initial impetus of doing these steps, is to try to get them to go back to the drawing board and say, hey, are we really going to do this? Are we going to risk, something much worse than is happening today? Will it be successful? I don't know. I mean, as Brad said, their doctrine calls this sea territory. Just look, for instance, James Shoal, which is further south than Second Thomas Shoal. A shoal is defined by a feature, a land feature that doesn't come above the surface of the water at low tide. So there's a shoal about 60, 70 miles off of Palawan at the southern end called James Shoal. And for 30 years, the Chinese have been going down there and dropping obelisks, stone obelisks, off their Coast Guard vessels, and they would drop them overboard into the shoal, and they were inscribed, chiseled by Chinese craftsmen, and it would say, this is our territory. And they'd have a ceremony, and they would say, to their people on the ship. They would videotape it, and then they'd put transcripts in Chinese magazines and take photos and say, we were down there marking our southernmost point of China's territory. Chinese children are taught in school that James Shoal is the southernmost point of China. So this is something that's going to be ingrained in them. It's been more, and it's because of the Chinese Communist Party. If you went back before 1949, that wasn't taught in Chinese schools. It's only been since the communists came in that they've had this expansionist view and sea territory. So we're going to be fighting up against an ideology about that. So part of the reason that we need to stand up, because there's people in China that don't really like the Communist Party. And we saw that during COVID, right? With the white sheets, and people didn't like being, under those kind of totalitarian controls. So not everybody in China is good with the Chinese Communist Party. We need to stand up and lead that charge, just like Ronald Reagan did against the Soviet Union, in the face of many people that didn't want him to do that and thought it was crazy.
Right. But it's interesting too, as well, is that, President Trump, seems to see, when his administration comes to power, a very different view of China. What did they see? What's the tipping point for them to look at China with a very different set of eyes compared to previous administrations, and certainly what seems to be with the current administration too, as well?
You want to
Any
go,
thoughts
Brad?
on that, Brad or Jim?
Well, certainly, Doug. The Trump administration recognized the state of the United States, right? The hollowing out of our manufacturing, the problems that the American people were facing in terms of economic issues, but also a crisis of the soul, if you will, due to the loss of jobs and the loss of stable communities that existed throughout the United States, which the engagement school actively hollowed out to send to China to help them with their wealth creation and power, ability to project power now globally. So the Trump administration recognized the realities of the 21st century, which is the United States has real problems economically, socially, culturally that have to be addressed. Equally, twinned with that was the recognition of, again, what was happening right in front of our nose, which was the PRC was expanding. It was becoming hyper-aggressive, not just, if you will, hide and bide under Deng Xiaoping, then increasing aggression, increasing power projection under his successors to Xi Jinping, where the mask fell off. He took the mask off and started to talk about really his designs very openly for domination, his designs for global dominations very openly. So the Trump administration recognized reality and the stark realities of the 21st century, which is it's not 1989 anymore, it's not 1991 anymore, where the United States does not have a peer rival. In fact, in 2016, we have a peer rival, and that peer rival is gunning for us. And so the Trump administration did its best against significant opposition to turn the rudder, to keep Jim's nautical metaphors. And we'll see, obviously, we're in the midst of a campaign presently, and we'll see whether the American people choose to support the continuation of neo-engagement or want to recognize, again, the realities of the 21st century, which is the full scope and nature of what is fundamentally an evil regime, right? It's the Chinese Communist Party is not a legitimate political force. They were put in power by the Soviet Union and sustained in power by the Soviet Union, and there's very little that's Chinese about them, right? It's essentially a product of Soviet imperialism. And when we recognize that, we can see that they're a fetter. They're a tremendous weight, a crushing weight on the Chinese people who deserve a far better political system. And Taiwan demonstrates that better political system on a daily basis, which is why they're so aggressive towards Taiwan, is that in the realm of political warfare, Doug, Taiwan demonstrates again daily what the People's Republic of China should have been, could have been, right, if it hadn't been for the victory of the communists in the Chinese Civil War. that's in part, in large measure, to my mind, why they're lashing out at the new Taiwanese president, who was just inaugurated this week, because he shows that the Chinese people can have a far better political system than the tyranny of the Chinese Communist Party.
Sure. Let's go through real fast some of your recommendations that you make in your book. Let's go through, let's say, the top 5. What do you think the United States should do? I mean, if you're sitting in front of a new president, you've got an audience with the current president, and you could talk about your recommendations, what would you tell this person?
I would say, Doug, if Jim, go ahead if you're.
Oh, no, go ahead, Brad. This is yours. You always do well on the first one.
Okay, well, Doug, with that intro, what we need to do is to understand the nature of the enemy, that the People's Republic of China is the enemy of the United States, and that requires a whole of government, whole of society response. Secondly, we need to understand the nature of the enemy, and that means we need to understand communism, the ideology of this enemy, and why accommodation with it won't work, right? There are no half measures. They're either going to win or we will. The dispositive question of the 21st century will be resolved, and that is, will freedom be able to defeat its challenges as it did in the 20th century, or will tyranny win? Will the totalitarian vision of the Chinese Communist Party win? And the future of the 21st century would be very dark indeed if that does indeed obtain. So, recognizing the enemy, recognizing the scope of it, and then thirdly, recognizing that we need to cut them off totally. Treat them as a pariah. They are not legitimate. They're an illegitimate government and should be seen as apartheid South Africa was, as an illegitimate government, not part of international society, that's not tolerated in international society. Trade and investment, right? We're funding them still, and that has to be terminated immediately, right? What's the right amount of trade with the People's Republic of China? 0 is the right amount of trade with the People's Republic of China. There's no reason whatsoever we should do it. What's the right amount of investment in the PRC? 0. All right, there should be no U.S. money going from essentially military retirees, the thrift savings plan, of course, which we've worked very hard to call attention to and to address. There should be no investment in the People's Republic of China. And so these are bold measures that need to be taken, fourthly, working with our allies, right? Again, recognizing that Taiwan is a state, and it should be recognized as an independent state, and it should be given every element that it requires, including U.S. Tactical nuclear weapons to deter aggression against Taiwan, and working with allies like Japan, Australia, India, and other states to ensure that Taiwan has a robust conventional deterrent, but also a nuclear deterrent. And it needs these things now. So there's so much to do, Doug, and I'll turn it over to Jim, of course, because he has others to add to it. But this is a good start of the bold steps that are needed to recognize the strategic realities of today, right? Right here, right now, in this moment. These are what we need to do in order to defeat this enemy. Jim?
Before you talk, I just want to ask Brad one follow-up question here, which is this. Of course, one of the leading headlines that you see daily, whether it's in Bloomberg, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, for example, some of our major media outlets, is the fact that, you've got Elon Musk and Tesla certainly invested in China, and certainly Apple has a sizable presence in China too as well. If you're the president of the United States, or if you're the Secretary of Commerce, for example, given the concerns that you have just laid out, would you suggest to these countries or companies that they just summarily pull out? That's just time to leave.
Absolutely. I mean, would they have invested in apartheid South Africa? Would they have traded with Nazi Germany? No, they wouldn't. So the appalling event in the Bay Area in November of 23, where 400 American business leaders applauded, gave a standing ovation to communist dictator Xi Jinping on American soil, right, twice gave him a standing ovation, shows the nature of the problem. Wall Street has been saying to the Biden administration, as well as broadly to the national security community, unless you tell me they're the enemy, I'm going to keep investing in them, right? Unless you tell me not to, I'm still going to trade with them. And so what's necessary is leadership, Doug. It has to come from, indeed, as you identified, the president, obviously the secretaries, key secretaries, conveying that message that no, it is not all right. This is not what you should be doing. In fact, the opposite of what you should be doing. Why is Apple manufacturing, or Elon Musk in China, right? He could do that in the United States, right? There's no reason onshoring and avenues to explore those elements need to be addressed as well.
Sure.
Jim?
And then one other thing here too as well. I mean, if you get this pullout, would it be difficult to achieve? And then finally, one of the things that does not get discussed a lot in the news media is the fact that you've got Muslims in China who are basically abused. I mean, I hesitate to use the term concentration camp, but you know, some of the stories seem to suggest that something like that is going on there, going on. Can you discuss that if you've got any more knowledge on this issue?
Well, indeed, they are concentration camps, and there is a genocide against Uyghur, Kazakh, and Kyrgyz Muslims in Xinjiang, right? East Turkestan, what used to be known as East Turkestan. There is the explicit policies of Xi is to destroy those cultures through a variety of mechanisms. Concentration camps for Muslim men in Xinjiang is widely documented. The cotton gulag, essentially coerced labor, slave labor to produce clothing, for example, was well documented by the Trump administration's Department of Homeland Security. For example, the reports on the cotton gulag and coerced labor in Xinjiang. And we've seen that tyranny, that oppression of Muslims spread. It's not just in Xinjiang now, but it's wherever Muslim communities are present in China, including in Southwest, South and Southwestern parts of China. So it is again, a genocide which is occurring in real time, and the world community says very little about it. And that has to be an issue which receives far greater attention from the United Nations, of course, from Amnesty International, and other essentially non-governmental organizations which address human rights, like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, and then also by the US, which has the ability to put pressure on firms, for example, that might be buying cotton, which is grown or clothing which is made in those areas. But fundamentally, it shows the nature of the regime, Doug. This regime is willing to aggress in international politics and does so on a daily basis, and it's willing to commit genocide against Muslims on its soil, and that's happening today. Again, it shows the contempt that they have for human rights, their rejection of religious freedom, and their rejection of the rights of minorities, and, if you will, fundamental respect for human rights and human dignity that this regime has, and it shows in international politics as well as at home.
Right. And when you think about the Chinese Communist Party, I mean, the idea of communism is that, you know, life is grand and life is peaceful. But the reality of it is, I mean, are they really communists in the Chinese Party, or are they really fascists?
Oh, they're communists, right? Fundamentally, I mean, this is a Stalinist government. Did Stalinism survive Stalin? It did indeed. Mao Zedong was the greatest pupil of Joseph Stalin, and his heavy hand still resides both in terms of the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party and the practical aspects of their government. We just talked about Muslim genocide, but we need to recognize that Mao killed as many as 42 million of his own people in a famine from about 1959 to 1961, 1962. That was a man-caused famine. Mao Zedong caused that famine, right, which was worse than the Holodomor, right, that Stalin created in Ukraine and in Kazakhstan and elsewhere in the Soviet Union. So we need to recognize the true nature of this regime, not to say the other human rights abuses that Mao Zedong created or that his successors did against Falun Gong, of course, against the church, other religious practices. This is the nature of the regime. Too few Americans know that. Too few Americans are cognizant of that. And so when you have, for example, the Xi Jinping chatbot, right, that just have announced that Xi Jinping thought is going to be forced on, basically in a very rigorous way, the Chinese people. There's no escape from it. It has all the hallmarks of course, a communist totalitarianism, which is what this regime is. And recognizing that allows us to see its similarities with the Soviet Union, and it allows us to see in stark terms, right, the relief of its tyranny and the relief of its evil.
Sure. Jim, you wanted to jump in here. I'm sorry, well, let's go back to you. How do you see things with China?
Well, I agree with what Brad's been saying, and I would just add on when we talk about some of these abuses, and Brad mentioned Falun Gong, let's just put it out there. Organ harvesting. China harvests organs from people. They take people and forcibly take organs from them. It's obscene. It's horrific, and that's been well documented. China also did what they're doing in Xinjiang. They did it, 30, 40 years ago in Tibet. There's a whole region of the world that was, Honified, if you will, Honification program by Mao to take control of Tibet. There's a similar effort going on today with Mongolia. Chinese or Hans are going into Mongolia and they're stamping out the Mongolian language and forcing people to speak Mandarin and change and get rid of their religion and all those things. So China is not just, if somebody wants to quibble about the word concentration camp, there's plenty of other examples. And that gets back to the question of why are we investing there and all of that. And I think there's another one that should really cause the CEO of Apple to be called before Congress and asked why he's investing, or Elon Musk in China. 100,000 people die in the last year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years from a drug called fentanyl, opioid, that comes in from China into Mexico. That's now been well documented that the factories are south of San Diego and are being pumped in with precursor materials directly coming from the People's Republic of China. And the Chinese government knows about it. The Chinese government is actually promoting it, even though in public they tell their counterparts in the U.S. government that they don't know anything about it, they can't control it, it's a big country. Well, that's all a lie from the Chinese Communist Party. So when we ask ourselves, why should we trade with somebody, and the question was almost asked, and we get it frequently, it's almost like we should feel really like bad about asking Apple and Boeing and General Electric and these other companies to pull out of China because it'll hurt shareholder value. Well, I don't really give a rat about shareholder value with this kind of murder going on in my own fellow citizens, especially after I wore a uniform to defend the nation. So I think that really the onus of moral turpitude should be on the companies that have done this and put themselves in a position where they're going to take a hit economically. It's going to hurt to do this. But if they don't do it, then they're going to be, their company will probably be taken over by some Chinese invention of their own. Well, we're seeing that already happening slowly with Apple. We're starting to see the Chinese, and they're doing it in the electrical vehicle market. They've done it over and over and over again. They steal our technology. They first entice the Americans to come in. It's an age-old enticement that goes back, to the pre-opium wars. That American businessmen thought that if they could sell a widget in China, they could make millions of dollars. So our greed has driven us there. The Chinese Communist Party incentivized it with tax relief, tax incentives. They suck you in. Your business is there. You make some money initially. They steal the technology, and then they create their own. The government subsidizes it, and they steal that market from you. And it will happen. And so it's kind of incredible in one sense that we've actually, not just the military and the US government, but the business community has allowed themselves to be duped as such. So, which gets to this, list of recommendations. One of the, in addition to what Brad's listed, is internally, we have to have an accounting. We have to have an admission that we were wrong about the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic of China. And we use a couple of examples in the book. We use the 12 steps of AA. The first step is admitting that you got a problem. I use the other example of cancer. If you have a tumor inside of you, which I had 35 years ago, and you don't deal with that tumor, the doctor tells you and gives you a CAT scan and says, hey, you got a tumor the size of a grapefruit in your abdomen, and you don't deal with it, you're not going to live. You're going to die. So we have a cancer. We have a cancer in our abdomen of the body politic. And if we don't cut this cancer out, which is pro-engagement, unconstrained, unaccountable engagement with the PRC, it's going to end up killing the United States of America. And we don't want that. And that's why we wrote the book. Some other things that we need to do is, if you recognize that you have a problem inside, for instance, in the intelligence community, we have a groupthink. We have a major problem with groupthink over the last 40 years, where everybody went along and said, China's not a threat, China's not a problem. And it's so pervasive that even today, you have headlines from The Guardian where yesterday or the day before, the UK's defense minister, General Capt, came out and said that China is supplying lethal aid to Russia in the war in Ukraine. And we had said, 2 years ago when that war started, hey, if anybody does that, that's you go on the bad boy list, you go in the doghouse. Well, our national security advisor has denied that and said, I was worried about it, but I haven't seen any evidence to that. So this is how deep and entrenched the engagement school will go, the do not provoke school will go. So I don't know what General Capt has seen that Jake Sullivan hasn't seen, but clearly there's been a lot of reporting about aid going from China to Russia via North Korea and other things, flight manifests, other kinds of speculative. Sure, it's speculative in some sense, but this is in the public domain. There's certainly stuff in other domains that's probably out there. So kill 100,000 Americans with fentanyl, skirt around the international sanctions and dealings with Russia as they slaughter Ukrainians, and yet everybody's going to say, hey, let's have another cabinet secretary go, like we saw last year with Blinken and Yellen, Raimondo and Kerry and Kissinger, and then Biden down in San Francisco in November of last year, and now Blinken and Yellen going again already this year. So they can't get enough of going to the trough and kowtowing the Chinese Communist Party. And somebody has to come in and say, this has got to stop. It's a lethal threat, and we can't continue to do this. And that's going to take leadership from the top to do that. It's going to be the American people that may demand that, but eventually it has to be somebody that sits behind the resolute desk that's going to lead that charge, like we saw many years ago.
Sure. And it's hard to believe that a British general would just fire off their mouth.
Correct.
Something that they would see. I mean, it's a bit challenging to sort of say, well, they're just making it up, if I'm correct. Retired U.S. Navy Admiral James Stavridis, who was obviously in the media often, suggested one morning on Bloomberg Radio that the U.S. Navy's combat experience gives it a leg up against the Chinese Navy. Jim, how do you see that?
Yeah, I know the admiral, and he's got a storied career, but I would disagree with him fundamentally on that. I mean, in fact, when's the last time the United States fought a naval battle? Now, up until about this last month, I could say we hadn't had one since maybe skirmishes in the Vietnam War or the Korean War. But we did have some people that are in harm's way in the Red Sea here in the last month. The USS Carney just came back home after successfully swatting down, Houthi anti-ship ballistic missiles, the first attack from an anti-ship ballistic missile in history, and drones and rockets. So we have to give our sailors credit for being able to defend themselves, and that's great, and I'm proud of them. But on the other hand, sinking an enemy fleet that, like the PLA Navy, in open ocean, blue water, war at sea, is something that we have not done. So to use that to make that comparison and say, well, the Chinese haven't fought a naval war, well, either have we. Now, we practice and we go to sea, but most of our last 35 years, we've been devoted to fighting land wars. I remember one time Admiral Mullen, when he was the chief of naval operations, before he was a chairman, he proudly boasted to Congress in congressional testimony that he had more sailors ashore in the CENTCOM AOR than he did afloat. So from the time I joined the U.S. Navy in 1986, and it was all about war at sea against the Soviet Navy, by the time I got out of the Navy, we were not really focused and aware, not aware, we were not focused on war at sea like we were in the Soviet era. And that's somewhat changed over the last 9 years since I've been retired. I think our admirals are starting to get it, but it's a piecemeal approach. You've seen the reports in the congressional hearings about the status of our shipyards. We had a report about 2 months ago out of U.S. Naval Institute regarding our Mark 48 torpedoes that we shut down production for 20 years. Mark 48, our heavyweight torpedo. And then we all of a sudden recognized China was a threat about 4 or 5 years ago, and they started to try to rebuild that Mark 48 inventory, and they found that they didn't have the expertise, people to even do basic things like soldering and the kinds of work that's required to build those torpedoes. The same thing's happening in shipbuilding production. Dr. Jerry Hendricks just put out a piece here about the submarine community and the submarines are themselves, the lack of field or pier space to do repairs and maintenance that's putting severe pressure on our submarine fleet and the numbers that are required that we all thought were going to be our ace in the hole, if you will, to defeat the Chinese Navy. So we've got a lot of problems, and part of it is this idea that we don't really respect the threat. So when I hear Admiral Staff Freitas say, "Well, don't worry, they haven't fought a naval war, so we're still going to do well." I get that. He was an operator, and he was, operators are always look on things on the side of, I have to get the mission done, so I'm going to be positive. Because if I come in like the intel officer and say things are, here's the real threat and the capabilities, then that kind of is, gets people. It's a negative way of looking at things, and it can be demoralizing. So commanders, by their innate nature, have to keep the morale of troops and sailors up. So that's what people like Admiral Stavridis do. They keep a good job at that. But we have to be truthful to ourselves. We have to deal in reality. And the reality is the Chinese Navy has weapon systems that are superior to ours. For instance, anti-ship cruise missiles. They have a vast array of anti-ship cruise missiles that are designed, and anti-ship carrier missiles that are specifically designed to sink our carriers. We don't have such weapons in our system today, like at the numbers and ranges and capabilities that the PLA Navy does. And so we need to, again, when we admit that if we recognize power politics, we recognize the threat, we admit that we've made a mistake, that can then unleash the power of America to rearm ourselves. And I think, time is really running out, and there's not much hope out there, and some people have said that, but we still are Americans. We still are the nation that defended the world several times throughout our history, and we can do it again. But we have to become unified on this threat, and we have to kind of turn on full attention and general quarters, if you will, to take action. And we can't just piecemeal it anymore.
Right. Let's just talk here for a second here about American strengths. What are unique American strengths that we've got that the Chinese just don't have?
Our ideology. Right? It's in the realm of political warfare, we win this hands down. I mean, do you want to live in a liberal society, or do you want to live under tyranny? People vote with their feet, Doug. And what are we witnessing? Right? We're witnessing tens of millions of people are coming into the United States because they want to be here. They're allowed in by the Biden administration. They're not coming in legally, but they're coming here. And they're coming to the West more broadly, right? Our ideology is one which offers a recognition of human dignity and of the nature of humanity. It's realized in political liberalism, right? Understanding political liberalism as our ideology, going back to our founding fathers, the ideas that are embodied in the spirit of 1776 in our founding documents. The greatest freedom provided to humanity was provided in the American Revolution. and follow-on revolutions, of course, which have allowed democratic states, first a bit haltingly, but then to flourish, really under the aegis of the United States and the protection that the U.S. provided the West. Additionally, our civilization, again, because the Chinese communists are an artifact, they're a colonial project of the Soviet Union, right? Paradoxically, they're tied to the West. They're a product of the West. And so that great tension that exists for Xi Jinping about trying to impose on the great Han people, on the greatness of China and its civilization, a Western ideology, right, is incomprehensible. And it goes a large way in explaining the problems that they have. So our freedoms, they're, if you will, profound tensions and contradictions that exist with the Chinese Communist Party are within the realm of politics and within the realm of political warfare, are great strengths if we call attention to them. The US is a far better ally for people around the world than the People's Republic of China, because wherever the People's Republic of China shows up, right, it's defined by exploitation of people and the environment. And you can go around the world, whether it's in South America or Africa or Southeast Asia, and that lesson is stark, and that lesson is very clear. I'm fond of quoting a Gambian politician named Guy Scott, who gave an interview to The Guardian in 2006, where he was asked about China's presence in Africa and Zambia in particular. And former Minister Scott said, well, we've had bad people before. The whites were bad, the Indians were worse, but the Chinese are worst of all, right, in terms of just exploitation of African people. So those are profound strengths, and that allows the world to see whether tyranny is going to be essentially setting the norms, the principles, the order for the 21st century, or whether we'll have a rebirth of freedom, and so and of the recognition of the strengths of liberal democracy. So, Doug, people vote with their feet, right? The People's Republic of China does not have an illegal immigration problem. The West does, because people want to come here, and that's telling.
Sure. Let me go into, and maybe Jim, you're the best one to answer this question, but British military historian B.H. Littlehart, in his book, The German Generals Talk, which is about when he interviews those Third Reich generals who survived in World War II. Maybe he didn't get to all of them, but he got to a number of them. And he assesses them this way. He says, quote, the older professional leaders trained under the general staff system tended to prove highly efficient but lacking in genius. He goes on to write that they frowned on novel ideas and were limited in understanding of any factors outside of the military. Just thinking about his assessment of the German generals, which wasn't so positive in World War II, how do you see the talents and the abilities of the China's admirals and generals? Good, bad, indifferent, incredibly talented, or are they no match for us? Or are we no match for them?
Yeah, Doug, I would say that kind of assessment, if you made it about the PLA 35 years ago, 30 years ago, would be more applicable to the PLA. But what we've seen, especially under Xi, has been a real, I'd say, it actually started under Jiang Zemin. He was considered by some of their people in uniform as their kind of Ronald Reagan, their father military, who really started the modernization. And it continued under Hu Jintao. But Xi has done something, and it started in 2015. He started before that, I think, laying the foundations internally inside the party and the Central Military Commission. But it was fundamentally, it became known to the world when he reorganized the PLA and did a dramatic reorganization. And folks may not know about that. But in 2015, he basically reorganized the PLA in a fundamental ways. He reduced the size of the PLA from 2.3 million uniform members to 2 million. He got rid of 300,000 people that were not involved with warfighting, people that ran dance troupes or operas, or had stores and things of this nature, very much like the old Soviet model where they had corruption everywhere. So he eliminated those people. He reorganized from 7 military regions that were kind of independent fiefdoms, but run by the army, into 5 theater commands. And those 5 theater commands more resemble our American combatant commander joint. They're almost carbon copies of them. They're joint organizations run by different officers from different services. On the service front, and they all have a geographic area of responsibility. And then on the service level front, he created a PLA Army directorate. So essentially the PLA Army ran the PLA and all the services up until 2015. And he basically brought them down to be equals amongst the Navy and the Air Force. And then what we see is they also created this strategic support force, which is like our cyber command in some sense. They've just reorganized that here, information support force. So they've renamed that, but they're really getting into the details of what's required and separating out space from cyber and EW. And they have increased their training. They train together in joint operations. I mean, for over a decade, they've been doing joint operations together between the services, and I've witnessed it when I was in uniform. And then I think, one of the most important things just happened here at the end of 2023, and now as we're into 2024, which was in December, there had been a 3 or 4 month gap in the Minister of Defense in the People's Republic of China. And it was General Li Shangfu. And there was some rumors about corruption, or nobody really knew, but it was rumored corruption or rumored that he was, and the other generals were unhappy with Xi. It was all this controversy. There was some missing folks in the strategic rocket force that weren't seen. So there's all these rumors going around, which is quite typical sometimes of trying to get into what's going on in the PRC. But anyway, in December, it was announced that the head of the PLA Navy, Admiral Dong Jun, was now going to be the 14th Minister of National Defense for the People's Republic of China, and the first admiral in the history of the People's Republic of China. So when you take B.H. Littlehart and his examination of those German generals from World War II, I get it. But what I would say is that the Chinese are on a different trajectory. They're on a trajectory of moving away from that kind of stilted, hierarchical thinking and stovepipe thinking, and they're moving into joint operations. They've gone to school on the United States since the Kosovo War, since the Desert Storm. In fact, they've studied that extensively. So they've studied all of our conflicts. They know what works. They know that joint's important, and they've been using that. And they're now putting an admiral in charge of the People's Liberation Army for the first time in history. It's a historic moment in the history of the PRC and of the PLA. And what's really important is that this admiral, 10 years ago, when he was a brand new admiral, was put in charge of the very first East China Sea Joint Operations Command Center. And I remember I was in uniform. I remember when that stood up. It didn't get a lot of press, but that was the first time that the Chinese had stood up a Joint Operations Center, right in the first year or so of Xi Jinping's reign of the PRC. And they stood up this Joint Operations Center. It's in the Fujian province. And what is their mission? To take Taiwan. So he was the first commander of that Joint Operations Command Center. And now here he is in charge of the PLA. So you have what I think is the exact opposite. And I think sometimes because of the influence of the engagement school, we have people in Washington that tend not to see those things. They tend to ignore these kinds of evidence. And it's not just who they've appointed, which is important in what I'm telling you, but it's the actions that they're taking. It's what they're doing with their forces. So it's the capabilities that they built, it's the intentions that they say they have, and it's the key personnel that they put in charge to do this. And so I think there's more, especially in the Naval and Air Force, and probably not so much in the Army still, but in the Naval and Air Forces, there's a lot more, I think, value placed on innovation and getting the job done, doing whatever it takes to get the job done. Now it's a military. There's going to be constraints, and it may not be as like the American military, at least the one I remember when I retired. But we have not to downplay the capabilities or intentions or intelligence of our adversary. That's very dangerous.
Taiwan is obviously in the news today. It goes in and out of the news quite often. And this is my last question. And thank you so much for your generous time. Very much appreciated. But if the U.S. fails to defend Taiwan successfully, what does it mean for the United States diplomatically? What does it mean for the United States militarily and possibly economically?
Well, I'll start. Jim, I'll start just quickly. It matters. It's extremely significant. Taiwan matters, Doug, for economic reasons. They're the world's superpower in chip production. And if that's destroyed, as it would be very likely in a conflict, that's going to have a profound effect on the global economy. Secondly, Taiwan matters geostrategically because you can think of it as a cork in the bottle. Douglas MacArthur called Taiwan an unsinkable aircraft carrier that allows it not only to serve as a cork in the bottle, but also to allow power projection against the People's Republic of China. So it's strategic territory, right? Realtors always tell us location, location, location is everything in real estate. Well, location is a lot in geostrategy as well. So Taiwan matters for that reason. And then thirdly, it matters for that political warfare reason. It shows that Taiwan's a democracy, a thriving economy, a thriving democratic state. It shows what the People's Republic of China might be. So if that is lost, what do we lose? We have profound economic effects, right? And profound economic effects, right? That's going to be, we'd be flirting with depression if that happens. We lose, obviously, an element of incredible geostrategic value that connects Japan through Taiwan to the Philippines and other allies and partners of the United States. And then we lose, of course, that illumination of what China should be and might be once again. So if we fail to deter the PRC's aggression against Taiwan, the costs are fundamental. It really changes the geostrategic landscape in the Indo-Pacific and globally. What is the implication diplomatically? Allies are not going to believe the United States. It's going to put tremendous stress on the credibility of the U.S. and our extended deterrent commitments that we have to Japan, to Australia, but also in the Middle East and Europe as well, and in NATO Europe, if the United States allows that aggression to come off. And I would just add a final point before turning to Jim for his profound insights, but the element would be the recognition, of course, that deterrence is everything, Doug. This is the time to deter. We don't want Taiwan to be lost, right? We do not want aggression to occur. And thus deterrence is absolutely essential to ensure that Xi Jinping recognizes whatever his desire is, and it's a very great desire, it cannot be realized at an acceptable cost. Jim?
Yeah, I would just add that if the nature of how Taiwan falls, if it were to fall, heaven forbid, but if it were to fall, the nature of how it falls is important. If it falls through political pressure and some kind of political outcome like we saw in Hong Kong, that leads a lot to what Brad discussed. But let's be honest, there's a great probability or possibility, I wouldn't say it's a probability at this point, but there's a great possibility that it could be an armed conflict. And if that was to occur, then you have to look in the aftermath of that. There's going to be dead people in Taiwan on an order of magnitude that will make Ukraine look like a day in the park. In addition to that, there'll likely be a dead Americans because the Chinese, as part of their counter-intervention strategy, is designed to keep us away. We call it anti-access area denial. And that strategy targets American forces in the region. So there's going to be a carrier maybe at the bottom of the drink. There's going to be bases that are burning. Those bases are, in Guam, they're in Japan. So what does this do to ignite a conflagration where maybe Japan gets involved. And if it does end in the first method peacefully, you still have to ask yourself, what is Japan going to do? For 2 decades, the Chinese Communist Party has been preaching about Japan's war crimes. And Japanese know that the Chinese Communist Party hates Japan. So this is going to ignite, conflict in the region if China is allowed to take Taiwan. So as Brad said, deterrence is really the key. We're not arguing for boots on the ground. We're not arguing for endless wars. What we're arguing for is to deter an illegitimate bullying regime. And we have to use all elements of our national power to be able to do that. And it looks pretty bleak right now. We talked to somebody yesterday, and they said, I don't see how you can be hopeful at all. Well, we have to be hopeful. There's no other option, right? And so I think we have to recognize that we have to dig deep, and we have to say to ourselves, we have to take action to deter this because it's that important. You hear sometimes people say, well, it's just a bunch of rocks in the South China Sea or in the Ryukyus, or Taiwan's a foreign country. What do we care? But we care for all these reasons because it won't stop there. China's goal isn't just to stop and take Taiwan and say, okay, it's all over. We're happy. They have told us in many ways over and over again, and Xi has specifically stood them up: the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative. These are all initiatives that the Chinese Communist Party has formally staffed and promoted and publicized and is implementing through places like the World Trade Organization, like the United Nations, like the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, even in Europe with this recent swing through that Xi just had in Europe, meeting with the French and the Hungarians and the Serbians. So I think we have to recognize that their aspirations, and you probably, maybe people have heard this term, Tianxia, all under heaven. So if you go back before the Communist Party running China, there was the dynasties, and they would talk about the mandate of heaven that a Chinese dynasty would have from heaven to be the representatives of earth to heaven. And that was China's role. They viewed that as their role. And if you go back to the 1860s or 1700s, when they were really implementing that in the dynastic period, their world at that time was, around where China is today. They didn't really see the world globally, but they thought that was the world. In their mind, that was the world that they had to control and expand and influence, and have people come in and kowtow from Japan and Korea and other vassal states. Well, today in 2024, when China Communist Party views themselves as this kind of new dynasty, they don't say that in public, but they view themselves that way, and they view themselves that they have a mandate to restore themselves to the great power that China used to be. In order to do that in 2024, it has to have a global, in today's globalized world, they have to have global presence, global command and control. That's why 10 years ago, Xi started the Belt and Road. That's why there's BRICS. These organizations, RECAP, and all these efforts to bring in and create a new world order, largely aligned with the global South, South Asia, Africa, Latin America, and then, making inroads into the elites that they've captured in Europe and in America. And that's their plan. And so Taiwan is a key, it's like the bulwark of it. It's almost like, I don't remember the year, Brad will be able to tell me, but when the Mongol hordes were, outside the gates of Vienna, that was, if Vienna had fallen, the world would be a different place. And we all know that, we all understand that. And in much the same way, if Taiwan falls, the world will be a much different place, and it won't be a good place.
Right. So they'd like to turn the Pacific Ocean into a Chinese lake if they could. Certainly, they probably have designs on the Atlantic Ocean too as well. They do. They're already operating in the Atlantic. We've watched them operate oceanographic research ships for a decade out there, which is usually a precursor to naval or submarine operations. They have their fishing fleets out there. They just sent last year their 43rd Naval Escort Task Force did a swing after 3.5 months in the Gulf of Aden, escorting commercial vessels through the Gulf of Aden. They went up through the Red Sea, the Suez, across the Mediterranean, and then down the west coast of Africa. And they spent literally a month and a half in
in the west coast of Africa, there along Nigeria and along those island nation or coastal nations, spending 5-day port calls with their 3 ships. And they were basically showing their flag and preparing for what will be a naval base like they have in Djibouti on the west coast of Africa.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so very much for your generous time today. It has been very enlightening to speak with you and to learn more about China and to hear your expertise and your knowledge on the topic, which obviously you bring a lot of. If you publish another book, certainly hope to come back again. Would like to be able to talk to you one more time. We've certainly gone over the amount of time that I thought we were going to go over, but it was certainly an enjoyable conversation and certainly very, very enlightening. Thank you so very, very much.
Doug, thank you very much indeed for the opportunity. It was a great conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. It was really appreciated, and hope the people of San Diego and others that watch it have learned something.